Hello, this is my presentation on DOM manipulation in JavaScript. So to start out, what is DOM? DOM stands for Document Object Model, and I didn't really quite conceptualize this until I really had to focus on understanding what it is. So really, in essence, it's the page that's loaded in the window browser. The document object is ultimately an object in JavaScript itself. So arrays are objects in JavaScript, and just like you can access parts of an array, you can access those parts of the array, you can view them, you can change them, you can delete them, you can add to them. That same object exists as the DOM, can be accessed and manipulated and changed, and that's what DOM manipulation ultimately is. It's taking that one big object that consists of everything that is produced onto the screen and accessing it, changing it, and manipulating it in a way to ultimately change the object itself. When we refer to the object itself in the text editor, we're going to basically say document dot. That'll reference the object itself, just as if it was we're trying to reference any other array. Document dot, and then we'll do whatever we're going to do with that. So that's what the DOM is. So steps to changing or manipulating the DOM. First, you need to select the element of the DOM that you're going to change. Then you need to store that element as a variable, or in a variable. Then you're going to manipulate it using properties and methods that are pre-built into Java. We're going to go through this. So step one, if you wanted to manipulate a paragraph, you would select the element is going to be P. You're going to need to use one of those preset functions or methods to select it itself. One of those selectors that's common is query selector. And then you're going to pass P into that function as a parameter. So it'll be query selector P. And then to completely reference it, we're going to say document to reference the DOM or to reference that object, dot query selector P. Okay, so now that we've selected it, we're going to store it into a variable. So this is what we selected. Now we're going to make that function that we have there equal to the variable. So we're going to say var my variable equals document dot query selector P. And that's our variable, so that's step two. Here's a list of different selectors. There's probably a whole lot more than this, but the one we just used is the first element of its kind. So in the example I used, the first paragraph that it would come to would be the paragraph that you're manipulating. Or you can do selector all, which would do all paragraphs, or by ID, which would be any element, not just a paragraph or whatever, any element that has that specific ID. My name tag, any tag. So if you wanted to pull out a specific HTML tag, it would change that element. Or class, every element with that class. All right, so step three, we're going to take that variable and we're going to manipulate it. Okay, so at this point we need methods in the HTML element interface that do this. One of those methods, and there's a long list of different methods, is text.content. What this does is it changes the text inside a property. Now you can think of different ways that you would want to manipulate an element, and you may not necessarily want to manipulate it by just changing the text inside that property. Maybe it's some other thing, and so you'd need to find an element or a method that does what you want it to do. So in this case, we're going to change the text of that element. So we'll just take that variable, my variable dot text dot element. Okay, and then what we want to do is we need to say how we're going to change it. So in this situation, what we're going to do is we're going to take my variable dot text content and equal, and then this is what we're going to do to it. So in this case, we're changing it to be a string. This is what I want the text to be. So this is what it would look like. First, the first line of the text editor would say var my variable document dot query selector P. Then my variable dot text content equals, this is what I want the text to be. That changes the DOM, or the document object model, to contain the string. This is what I want the text to be in that specific element of the object. Okay, so here's some other places to look for other methods that are similar to text.content. And you would also look for the components of the HTML element, which is where text.content is found. So you can look through some of these websites. Okay, so another way to manipulate the DOM is to apply a class to an element, or this is one way that it helps us to manipulate the DOM. We can apply a class to an element. So the steps are very similar. So just like step one, we're going to find the element that we want to do. In this case, we'll use P as an example. We want to change the class of P, or of a specific P. Then we're going to create a variable. So we're going to say my variable equals document.create element P. Create element is a function that ultimately creates that element. So that's a pre-built function that we would insert there. Then what we want to do is we want to manipulate it. Okay, and so we're going to take that same variable, my variable dot set attribute, and the first there's two components of this. It's slightly different than the last example where we just put in the way we wanted to manipulate it by equal and then putting in a string. In this case, there's two arguments that we need to put in. The first argument is where you put in the class. Since we're trying to apply a class to an element, we'll say that it's class. Then we want what that class equals hero. This is just an example. It could be whatever you're going to name the class. So once we do that, we can manipulate the CSS for .hero in our style sheet when we get to that point. So another way to manipulate the DOM is to add an image with source and alt tags. So again, similar to before, first step would be to find an image. That's the element that we want to manipulate. Second would be to set it equal to a variable. In this case, we'll create a variable called myImage, var myImage equals document.create element image, img. Step 3 is actually, we're going to do step 3 twice because we're doing a source and an alt tag. So we'll change the source. So we'll do myImage.setAttribute, which is another preset function. And then src because it's basically going to be a link. And then we would put the link or the path to where that picture is, if it were to be a website or if it were to be in our on our desktop or whatever. That's where we would put the link. Then step 3 would be where we do same exact process. myImage.setAttribute again, alt instead of src, and now it's alt. And then we would add the alt text, whatever that text you're going to make, and that would set the attribute alt to equal to whatever the text you did here. Just like it would set the attribute src to equal whatever the link or the address that you're going to put for that picture. One of the final things is an event listener. Event listeners can be pretty cool. I'm not going to go into complete detail in them. However, what it does is an event listener is just like any event. On click, on load. This is a pretty good list of different events that can take place. It can be like hover, all kinds of events that can take place. And so what you would do is you can make the changes, some of the specific changes like we just talked about in the DOM when these events happen. And so an example would be, say I would take my image, which is a variable, and I would do .add event listener, and then the event or the attributes that I would put in here would be click. That's one that I picked. On load or whatever it is, click is an event. You find the event that you want to trigger that, and then the second component of that is the function that you want to take place. So if we wanted to use some of the functions that we just created above, just before this, to manipulate the DOM, you could take that, you would type function, parentheses, and then in the squiggly brackets, you would put your entire function in between these brackets. And that function would run when you click this element. In other words, my image, click, and it would run that function. So in other words, when you click on that picture, it will run that function, which maybe it does something simple like flips the picture or highlights the picture. It can do all kinds of things. Whatever manipulation of the DOM you did in that function, it'll do that. So that's my presentation. Thanks a lot.